Today we're going to be continuing on our topic of land and water resources by finishing up our last topic of forestry. We're going to look at the effect of forest fires on ecosystems, and we're also going to investigate national forests and the significance of national forests. And then we'll finish up today by beginning the topic of rangelands and rangeland management. This first image we're looking at here is of the pine barrens of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which is getting close to the northern range limit of a kind of an ecosystem that makes its way all the way down the east coast, all the way to Florida. The species involved change, but the nature of the system has some similarities throughout. One of the most important ones is the importance of fire to these systems. These pine systems are to a large degree maintained by fire, which burns out competitor species and creates an environment that is attractive for the germination of these pine seeds and the development of this predominantly pine community. If we go back to our introductory image, we're looking at the pine barrens of southern New Jersey, which is really the first large expanse of coastal plain forest that you find on the east coast. There is indeed some of the same community on Long Island, New York, and in fact the same species of pine tree is present in Cape Cod, and you can find that species all the way up into Maine, in fact. But this is where the coastal plain really begins. And this species of pine, pitch pine, has co-evolved with fire and in fact benefits from the effects of fire. You can see that it's kind of a savanna-like system. It's rather open. When fire burns through these areas, it kills off broadleaf trees, like especially the oaks. And it also makes the soil burn down to bare mineral soil. The heat of the fire will actually burn these pines as well, but the pines can recover. They'll send out needles right from the trunks of the trees. And as the pine cones on the trees heat up from the fire, they open and drop their seeds. They're called serotinous cones because of that. But the term serotinous relating to the ability to open up when they are heated. The seeds then drop into the bare mineral soil, germinate, and this ecosystem is perpetuated. So there has been a long history of relationship between species like this one and fire. And there are other species that relate similarly to fire. Here we're looking at the slash pine forests of Florida, central Florida, which have a similar ecological relationship with fire. And even to a greater extent, forests like these of the western parts of North America are intimately related to forest fire. So this image here shows forests at the high elevations of the Sierra Nevadas in California, and they are populated by species of trees like digger pine. Notice again how it's rather savanna-like, very open understory. Trees are kind of widely spread apart. And here's another image of lodgepole pine forests in western South Dakota. Lodgepole pine is a very important timber species in much of the western part of the U.S., and it also has this relationship with fire, whereby when fires burn through these areas, it makes them more hospitable for the pines, and it eliminates broadleaf competition. In fact, periodic fires help to keep the area from burning too hot. When you have regular forest fires, fires tend to be less hot, and so they are less damaging, and they do promote the development of these kinds of pine communities by preparing the soil for the seeds of these pines, just as we saw in the East. So, although we often think of forest fire as being a bad thing, in many instances forests and fires have co-evolved over millennia, and in fact certain ecosystems are perpetuated by fire being part of those systems. And so, although forest fires can be devastating in certain kinds of systems, in many others they are an important component. So we can see a lot of this sort of information summarized on this slide here. So certain types of eastern forests, and especially western forests, forests that are dominated by species of pines, these systems benefit from the effects of forest fire, and forest fire in fact is an integral component of these systems. On the other hand, deciduous forests are damaged by forest fires. These kinds of trees are often killed by the effects of fire. However, deciduous forests do tend to be rather fireproof when they are well-developed systems. They contain so much moisture and they so influence the microclimate within them that they make forest fires very difficult to get going. In the 19th century, when a lot of these eastern deciduous forests were being heavily logged using poor kinds of logging practices where lots of debris were left on the ground, in those instances forest fires did used to get going. But an intact system does indeed tend to be rather resistant to fires becoming established within them. So now let's turn our attention to the topic of national forests. National forests are areas of federally owned land that are in general managed for multiple use. They in many cases do permit logging to be carried out on them, but they also are managed for recreation, for wildlife, for watersheds, a whole variety of various sorts of phenomena, all of which are in the national interest. Fire has been one of the elements of these systems that has been increasingly recognized in recent years as an important management tool in these areas. And areas that for years had been protected from forest fires are now again being allowed to burn, with this recognition that fire has for a very long time been a component of these ecosystems. Certain portions of these national forests have been set aside as what are called wilderness areas, however. These are areas of minimal human impact, and they've been set aside to promote simply the natural values of these places. They're available for limited recreation, hiking, and that sort of thing, but no higher intensity kinds of use. They're areas that are windows on North America before the appearance of large populations of humans on the continent. Areas of old growth in national forests in particular have been the ones that have been set aside as wilderness areas. Now indeed there are wilderness areas that have been set aside that don't include old growth, but many of them do. So they protect a landscape that appears much as it did when the first Europeans arrived in North America in the 1600s. So let's take a look at a few of these national forests around the continent and say a few things about them. This first image is of the Great Smoky Mountains of the Southern Appalachians. And this area is one of those where there are still some significant stands of old growth. And some of these have been set aside as wilderness areas, areas that will never be logged and into which access is limited. The Great Smoky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains in general contains some of the largest remaining tracts of unbroken forest in eastern North America. It is a contiguous forest belt that runs from the northern tip of Florida all the way into Maine, and over much of that expanse, the forest is still in an unbroken state. This unbroken corridor has in recent years been acting as a route of immigration for large mammal species reoccupying parts of the range where they haven't been seen in centuries. So the moose, for example, has re-invaded much of the Northeast, as well as the fisher, which is a less large species, but still it had been pretty much trapped out of much of the Northeast for the better part of a century. Another species that has been showing signs of making a comeback in the East is the wolf. For the first time in over, well, the better part of 2 centuries actually, a wolf was found in the state of Massachusetts, for example. And it is thought that the population of wolves that managed to survive in eastern Canada is now using that Appalachian corridor to reoccupy range in eastern United States. Bears have been another one that have used the Appalachian corridor to reoccupy large portions of their range where they had long since been hunted out. And indeed, if we travel up the Appalachian chain to its northern limits, here we're looking at the Green Mountain National Forest of northern Vermont. And this area is indeed contiguous with that area in the Carolinas and even Georgia. Notice the spruce fir forests that cloak the highest elevations of these Vermont mountains. This is a very similar kind of an ecosystem to what is found on the highest elevations of those southern Appalachian mountains, as we discussed a long time ago under the heading of biomes. If we travel to the other side of the continent, we are now in the Angeles National Forest of Southern California. This is one of these ecosystems in which fire is an integral component, and forest managers have come to realize that, and they have reintroduced fire into some of these systems where it has been actively excluded for years. Notice that this photograph, taken in June, still shows snow on the highest elevations. The Rocky Mountains and Rocky Mountain related mountains of the far west are much bigger, much younger than those Appalachians we saw on the other side of the continent. We're now in a stand of subalpine fir in the high elevations of the Rocky Mountains in Utah. Now, much of the Rocky Mountains are also national forest, and the high elevations throughout much of that region includes communities that look pretty much like this one, although indeed there are quite a variety of different kinds of forest ecosystems in the Rockies, again, many of which are fire prone, and for which fire is an important management tool. So with that as a closing note on the national forests, let's descend out of those Rocky Mountains into the lowlands that surround them and enter the rangeland environment of the West. Let's talk about how that system is used by people. As with the western forests, fire is an important component of rangeland ecosystems, acting to suppress woody growth in these areas, especially toward the eastern end of where rangelands are found, where conditions are moist enough that woody growth is prone to become established without the presence of fire. Also, as with much of those western Rocky Mountain forests, Many of the rangelands of the West are also federally owned and managed just as the forests are for multiple use. Many of them are managed as grazing lands for cattle or other kinds of grazing animals, and they're also used for recreational areas and a variety of other kinds of purposes. Now, although most rangelands in North America are found west of the Mississippi in more arid portions of the continent, we do have some in the east, most notably in central Florida, in a region called the Kissimmee Prairie, which is not arid at all, as you can see in this photograph. It is a subtropical savanna kind of an environment which has been used extensively for grazing livestock, breeds of cattle that are comfortable in a subtropical environment like the Brahman breed are in particular widespread in the Kissimmee Prairie region. So let's talk a bit about rangeland management. One aspect of rangeland management is rather like what we've been seeing concerning managing forests using fire. Fire is also an instrument of management on rangelands. As we've seen, woody vegetation does tend to invade these rangelands. Even when they are fairly arid, woody vegetation can still invade to a certain degree. And so burning, actively burning areas through a process called prescribed burns, where people actually go out and set the fires, that can help to keep the areas in herbaceous vegetation. Now, if we are using these rangelands to graze livestock, there is, of course, a limit to how much these livestock can graze. If we have too many livestock per acre of rangeland, they can overgraze it and start killing the grasses and other herbaceous plants that they feed on. And so the concept of range capacity has been developed, which is a measure of how much acreage one needs to support a given number of livestock. Now, of course, there are a number of variables in this range capacity equation, however. One must know something about the productivity of the range, the growth rate of the grass, in other words. One must know what kinds of livestock one is putting on this land. Sheep and goats have a different sort of an impact on rangelands than do cattle. And cattle, in turn, have a different sort of an impact than do bison. And bison have been domesticated and are becoming an increasingly large proportion of the kind of livestock that we have, particularly on western rangeland, although they are being raised even in the east now. Now, if a rancher exceeds range capacity with livestock, then we are looking at a situation where grasses and other kinds of herbaceous vegetation are being killed, and their ability to hold soil in place therefore goes away. So erosion starts to happen, particularly in more arid rangeland where productivity is lower. When rangelands are overgrazed, significant erosion can occur, and even worse than that, rangelands can be deteriorated into desert kinds of conditions. Once the water holding capacity of the organic matter in the soil is depleted by killing off the grasses, then the areas do become more drought prone than they were before. At the more arid end of the rangeland spectrum, we get landscapes that look like this. This is what is referred to as the shrub steppe environment of the western part of North America. It is just one step past being desert as it is. Notice those blank areas in between the plants there. These sagebrushes are quite tolerant of dry conditions, but on the other hand, they make rather marginal kinds of conditions for grazing cattle. So it doesn't take a whole lot of grazing to turn an area like this into a desert environment like this one here, where there are few, if any, plants found, and the area has gone from being somewhat usable by agriculture to being not usable at all without the input of irrigation water, which in the West is already in very limited supply. So to summarize, if we overuse arid rangelands, this can lead to the process of desertification, turning arid rangeland into desert. And one has to realize that when one grazes animals on this kind of a landscape, one is not only removing biomass, but also the nutrients that are locked up in those living organisms. And nutrients can be removed from these kind of systems faster than it is replenished. This is not necessarily to say that arid soils are poor soils. Often that is not the case at all. So on that point, we are going to end for today. We're going to have a bit of a short program this time because we've just finished looking at several major aspects of natural resource use. Next time we're going to be starting on something completely new. We're going to be looking at the urban environment. So we'll start fresh with that next time.